Morning, everybody. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Academia SG's Singapore Studies Junior Scholar Seminar Series. My name is Teo Yu Yen, and I'm one of the editors of Academia SG. I go by pronouns she, her, and hers. I have dark-rimmed glasses, and I'm wearing a black outfit today. And I'm seated in my study, where behind me is a bookshelf. We're glad to have you join us today for a presentation by Victor Zhuang. Today's event is co-organized with the Nanyang Technological University's Wee Kim Wee School of Communication and Information. Before we begin, please note that we have simultaneous Singapore Sign Language interpretation by Nick Sung from Equal Dreams. We also have live captioning by iMedia. Our thanks to Macquarie University for funding this. Nix will be spotlighted throughout the session. If you would like to view the Singapore Sign Language interpretation, please use the Speaker View function. You may click on Speaker View on the top right-hand corner of your Zoom window. To access live captioning, please click the CC button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You may also use the URL which has been posted in the chat box. To minimize distractions, we ask that audience members keep your videos off and your microphones muted during the session until we arrive at the Q&A segment, when some of you may want to verbalize or sign your questions. If you have any questions or need help with troubleshooting, please message Sharon George privately using the Zoom chat function. So today's seminar is titled The Included: Thinking with Disability Studies in Singapore. Our presenter is Victor Zhuang, a PhD candidate in Disability Studies and Cultural Studies at the University of Illinois in Chicago and Macquarie University. He hopes to use his research to contribute to current debates about how inclusion happens, both in Singapore and around the world. Victor will be speaking for 30 minutes. Following Victor's presentation, Professor Philip Holden will offer some responses and comments. Professor Holden was Professor of English Language and Literature at the National University of Singapore and is now an independent researcher. He is also currently pursuing a master's degree in Counselling Psychology at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver. Philip and his work on Singapore literature and history will be known to many of you, and his writings have had immense reach in influencing scholars in a range of disciplines. We're very grateful that he's generously agreed to be a discussant today. After Victor and Philip have spoken, we will open for questions from the audience. I'll turn it over to Victor now. Victor?
Thank you, Yuyan, for the introduction. My name is Victor, and I am a PhD candidate at the University of Illinois at Chicago and Macquarie University, Sydney. I am a Chinese male with short hair, and today I'm wearing a white shirt and this roundish Harry Potter spectacles. My background is a wall with hand-painted triangles in pastel colors. I want to first start by thanking the people who have played a part in supporting my research and in making this seminar possible. First, the team at Academia SG for being supportive and for giving me an opportunity to present my work today under the Junior Scholar Seminar Series. In particular, Sharon, Yuyan, and Corey for all the support in the lead up to today's seminar. I would also like to thank Philip Holden for being my respondent today, especially for taking time out his busy schedule to read my work and to offer valuable comments, feedback, and encouragement. I would also like to thank the Wee Kim Wee School of Communication Studies, in particular, Professor Mei Lin and Professor Gerard Goggin for co-sponsoring my talk. In particular, Gerard for constantly believing in me and for being so supportive. And of course, Macquarie University for funding the provision of access today. I must also thank the work of the team at Equal Dreams, Nick and Sheila, as well as AI Media for the provision of access. Also, my advisors, Lenny Davis and Nico Matthews, for always supporting me in my work. And last but not least, to the audience for taking your valuable time to tune into my talk today. My talk today is titled, The Included: Thinking with Disability Studies in Singapore. Before I start, I want to highlight the two aims of my talk today. The first is, of course, to begin to introduce my work, which focuses on examining the logics of inclusion in Singapore today. I aim to do so in about 25 minutes, sketching out the key contours of my work and approach, and leaving plenty of time for questions from the audience. What I intend to do is to begin to describe the formation of a new figure of disability in Singapore and how that can speak with and against disability studies concerns. The second overarching aim is to focus on access as a performance. And you will see me reflect the aims of disability studies in presenting differently, such as describing my images, taking care to speak at a pace that is comfortable for interpretation and captioning, and to present my research in an accessible and jargon-free manner. My hope is that through this, we can focus not only on how we can think differently about inclusion in Singapore, but how inclusion can also serve as a form of praxis. In other words, as a form of action. To begin, I want to first take us back to 2004, when Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, LEEHSIEN was first sworn in as the third Prime Minister of Singapore. In his swearing-in speech, Lee made special mention of disabled people, highlighting how, as we continue to grow as a nation, we must also think of disabled people as our brothers and sisters. In other words, as family. Lee's invocation of the family reminds us of what Chua Beng Huat, CHUABENGHUAT, has highlighted as communitarianism, the adoption of Asian values, an ideology which places key importance on emphasizing collective well-being above individual rights and interests. Lee's speech would mark a new era where the inclusion of disabled people is actively pursued as government policy. In the years that followed, inclusion in Singapore is evident in public displays that highlight the embrace of disabled bodies. This climate of inclusion has seen Singapore sign and ratify the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, as well as increased spending on disability services. A state-led roadmap that charts the steps Singapore could take to develop a more inclusive society. The Enabling Master Plan is now into its third five-year plan from 2017 to 2021, and efforts are in preparation for the fourth. These visible displays of disability and inclusion have captured the attention of both the mass media and the public eye, so much so that to be inclusive has become a way of life in Singapore. This period that I have highlighted is the focus of my research. Specifically, I focus on what I call the biopolitics of inclusion in Singapore. By biopolitics, I refer to the term coined by Michel Foucault, MICHEL-FOUCAULT, which focuses on the processes by which life is itself fostered and governed. As a result of this focus on inclusion, a series of state-led initiatives have emerged. They include the See the True Me, which is a public education campaign, the building of accessible infrastructure, such as lifts and ramps, and the Enabling Village, which is an inclusive community space, as well as the Purple Parade, an annual carnival celebrating and promoting inclusion. Here on this slide, you see a poster of the See the True Me campaign in 2017, which features 4 disabled people and the slogan campaign, "Look beyond my disability, see the true me." Influenced by theories from disability studies and cultural studies, and using research methods ranging from media analysis, ethnography, archival research, and interviews, I examine the logics underpinning this era of inclusion in Singapore. I argue that in Singapore, the effect of inclusion is the emergence of a new figure of disability that I am calling the included. In the midst of this focus around inclusion, the attraction of wanting and desiring to be included is always present. By naming the figure of the included, I speak to what Robert McGruer, RobertMcGruer, has described as the uneven biopolitical incorporation of disabled people around the world, where some disabled people are included while others are not. The figure of the included is marked by the efforts of a state and its agencies that actively embraces disabled people, and also marked by disabled people embracing inclusion. So in thinking about the included, I want to signify not only the inclusion of disabled people, but also the aspiration to be included and the process of becoming so. At the same time, I'm also referring to the idealized final product, an inclusive society. And while my focus is on Singapore, the figure of the included seems to be one that can also be found in many other locations around the world. I also want to state that while I do not oppose inclusion as it is happening in Singapore, I'm suspicious of how we uncritically embrace it without examining its underpinning logics. Inclusion, while seemingly beneficent, must be understood as an effect of power that also produces effects of control and containment. To begin to understand the logics of inclusion, I turn first to the discipline of disability studies. Emerging from the disability rights movement, disability studies has grown into an interdisciplinary intellectual movement, one which moves away from traditional deficit accounts of disability in favor of recognizing and centering disability as the means to generate new possibilities to rethink society. The emergence of disability studies offer a key challenge to traditional ways of knowing disability, some of which are still prevalent today. I want to show us a few images in the local context which we might recognize, which highlights these traditional ways of knowing disability. The first image is an ad produced by the then Ministry for Community Development, Youth and Sports. It shows a social worker playing ball with two amputees, with the enlarged word hopeless across the ad. This is followed by the words, if not for Ruth Lin, a professional social worker, in smaller font. Here, this image recalls notions of how disability is seen as a state of abjection and despair. In other words, the disabled body is the figure of sympathy and pity. To be disabled is to live a tragic life. The next image was produced in the lead up to the 2016 Rio Paralympics. It features the Paralympian and former nominated Member of Parliament, Yip Ping Siu, YIP-PIN-XIU, sitting in her wheelchair in front of a double-decker bus. The image recalls what disability scholars Mitchell and Snyder, MITCHELL, SMYDER, discusses as the supercrip, one example of what they call the able disabled. Quote, those who exceed their disability limitations through forms of administrative creaming or hyperprostheticization, leaving the majority of disabled people behind, unquote. They highlight the supercrip or Paralympians as examples of the able disabled, the select few that are able to avail themselves to the support needed in the neoliberal world, included and different from that of ordinary disabled citizens. Here, I have an image of the disability movement in America. We see disabled people crawling up the steps of the Capitol. Some of them were later arrested, but this moment of disability politics was to lead to the eventual passing of the American with Disabilities Act in 1990. Such politics contrasts traditional frames of disability and is what Friedner and Osborne, Friedner, OSBORNE, term the disabled subject, where disabled people orientate to the language of disability rights and access explicit in the disability rights movement and disability studies. Such orientation shifts the focus away from the disabled body to the barriers created by a disabling society. This orientation also offers disabled people a means to challenge their exclusion in the world and has remained highly influential today. It allows for the appearance of a politics of disability based on a positive embrace of one's identity. However, because of the disabled subject's emergence from liberal nations like Britain and America, the way towards regaining disabled people's place in society is often through asserting their rights. As such, these nations have implemented laws towards attaining this goal. There is also a sense that other locations should be like this polities. The claims of John Kerry, John Kerry, US Secretary of State in 2013, to take the Americans with Disabilities Act as the gold standard is thus one way in which the idea of the disabled subject is exported to the world. The trajectory of inclusion in Singapore has had at least two key moments where it has intersected with these larger international flows. The first is in 1981, where over 400 disabled activists, including international activists like Ed Roberts, ED, ROBERTS, Vic Finkelstein, VIC, FINKELSTEIN, and many other disabled people gathered in Singapore to establish Disabled People's International, the first international disability-led organization. A Singaporean, Ron Chandran Dudley, RONCHANDRAN was also elected as its first chairperson. Here I have an image of the DPI, the Disabled People's International Congress in Singapore in 1981. 5 disabled people are sitting behind a table. Behind them is a banner stating Disabled People's International First World Congress, 30th November to 4th December 1981, Singapore. And on the extreme left of the image, you can see Ron Chandran Dudley. The founding of Disabled People's International in Singapore would be a key moment for disability activism and the international disability rights movement, contributing towards the global climate of inclusion today. It would lead to an explosion of disabled people's activism worldwide, as well as in Singapore, ultimately making it possible to pass the United Nations Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities in 2006. Now, Singapore's signing and ratification of the convention in 2013 is the other moment of meeting with these larger international flows. And in recent months and years, there is also a growing movement within ASEAN and Asia Pacific towards the assertion of disability rights. Yet, what I would describe as the era of inclusion in Singapore functions in different ways from what disability studies have highlighted. In the analysis of Mitchell and Snyder, MIT CHELL SNYDER, as well as Jasper Phua, JASBIR PUAR, disability rights and identity have functioned as a key capacitating frame used to challenge exclusionary practices. This image of Jason Goh, JASONGOH, a star employee at Uniqlo, is a key example of the figure of the included in Singapore. He is one of the ambassadors of the 2018 Purple Parade, holds a full-time job and contributes to society. Such stories of disabled people are frequently mentioned in the mediascape and also propagated in the state-led text of inclusion. Jason's story highlights how support systems, including government agencies around job placement and support, private businesses and community, can come together to enable the participation of disabled people in society. At this stage, it will be timely to highlight what I see as distinctive features of the logics of inclusion in Singapore. The first is the rejection of disability rights or disability equality legislation in Singapore today. Instead, inclusion functions by highlighting how all can come together to do their part. The affirmation of disability rights is seen as secondary to the cause. The second is the active role that the state and its agencies play in leading inclusion. But this is one that is based upon a communitarian logic where all are involved. The case of Jason Goh and others affirm this, one where state support, such as through SG Enable's job consultancy program, direct job support through community organizations like Minds, and businesses support for inclusive hiring practices pave the way towards inclusion. And of course, if we recall the hopeless ad, pun intended, sometimes there might be contradictions between the aims and policies of state agencies. The third is the rejection of what is commonly known as a welfare state, which has implications and impact for services for disabled people. In Singapore, the consumption of disability services, such as institutions and homes and programs, are paid for by the individual and their family, with the state providing means-tested subsidies. A consequence is that rather than becoming consumer of services, disabled people and their families are also required to have productive labor. But interestingly, the figure of the included is also marked by a paradox of visibility. The first is, of course, is the hypervisibility of the included. We see them everywhere, and we see disability featured almost daily in media reports. A common way of doing this is in celebrating disability, where disabled bodies and disability is marked out for inclusion, made visible in large-scale state celebrations, such as the Purple Parade and the National Day Parades. Here is an image of the Purple Parade in 2019. Everybody is dressed in purple. There is a number of disabled people as well as politicians of the ruling People's Actions Party. Yet, this visibility of disability is also marked by a certain invisibility. Now, what I mean is that in being included, disabled people might not claim disability as an identity, unlike the disabled subject I described earlier. This is often manifested in highlighting one's abilities over one's disabilities, so as to be seen as useful subjects in society. It reflects a desire to be normal, where disability is decentered, instead of the exceptional disabled people who has to overcome their disabilities to be included. The figure of the included highlights the making of the unexceptional and the ordinary. So in this frame, media representations of disabled people, such as those in the public education campaign like See the True Me, focus on marking their sameness with other citizens' bodies. As a means of wrapping up, I want to return to the aims of my talk, which is to examine the current era of inclusion and engage it in a conversation with disability studies. In centering on the capacitating logics of inclusion in Singapore, my focus is to show how inclusion involves a more complex intermeshing of the demands of the nation state, the community, the market, as well as the desires of disabled people themselves. And while disability studies has often focused on how disabled people are made peripheral and excluded as a result of debilitating effects, I examine the capacitating logics of inclusion, focusing on the ways in which disabled people are embraced within inclusion by state agencies and how they themselves embrace inclusion. As disability studies has highlighted, inclusion can be problematic. It can also conceal forms of exclusion. In other words, in thinking about inclusion in Singapore, we could and should ask how inclusion functions to exclude. One key example is the continued role that institutions and homes play in Singapore, which has been seen as problematic and discontinued in many other countries. However, the institutionalization has not gained force and traction in Singapore. Neither has it been a key topic of discussion among the various plans for inclusion laid out by the state. In focusing on the figure of the included, how can we think about those severely disabled and who reside in homes dotted all over the island? And conversely, what can the severely disabled tell us about the logics underpinning the included? Disability studies has also been prone to asking some questions and ignoring others as a result of its focus on exclusion and identity. This is despite some scholars highlighting the need to move beyond the politics of disability identity in conceptualizing new frames of thinking. A key question to ask is what happens when inclusion is led by state agencies and not disabled people and activists themselves? How can such configurations of inclusion in Singapore contribute to thinking and theorizing about disability differently and reimagining new ways and different ways to rebuild society? I explore these issues further in my PhD research, which I hope to eventually turn into a monograph. With growing awareness of inclusion globally and attention paid to the intersections of disability and aging in Singapore, my hope is that what I have shared today has offered you an introduction into the importance of critical research of disability in Singapore. I have listed my email, victor.zhuang@yahoo.com, for those of us who are interested to keep in contact. We also have an active Facebook group, Disability Studies in Singapore, where we critically discuss issues regarding disability. So feel free to join us there. Thank you for listening to my talk, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you very much, Victor, for sharing your work. That was really very interesting and insightful. And I think there's already a lot of interest from the audience members to deepen the discussion. But before we go to that, I would now like to invite Philip Holden to provide his commentary. Philip?
Great. Okay. Great. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, thank you again, Victor, for that talk and for your research. Is always so fascinating to me. Just to say for everybody who's watching, my name is Philip. I go by he, him, and his. I've got a gray beard and I've got red rimmed spectacles and I'm wearing a gray turtleneck and a blue sweater today. And I'm using Zoom's new blurred background to hide my very messy room, right? So in these junior scholar seminars, I've noticed there are a lot of questions and already in the chat, there's a lot coming in. And I don't want to take up too much time. But I thought what I might say is something about Victor's intellectual project as I've encountered it and how it might serve as a model for other younger scholars. And then I do have a couple of questions for him. So I first ran into Victor's work a couple of years ago when I was researching a paper on narratives of schizophrenia in Singapore. Issues to do with mental health or neurotypicality aren't the same as disability studies, but there are parallels. And so I started reading. And first I came across the special issue of Spores on critical disability studies in 2007. And then I thought, who is Victor? Who is Zhuang Kuansong? And then the database searches. And then I found some of Victor's early articles and I got in touch. And I learned more about what he was doing and also the Singapore Disability Studies Facebook group. And I think what we're doing in all these seminars is engaging with the intellectual work that junior scholars do. But I think there's another question for junior scholars. How do you place yourself in a higher education environment that's increasingly driven by neoliberalism? How do you make a strong ethical commitment to your work in an environment which encourages you to be calculating, to respond to the demands of hiring committees, and then tenure and promotion? And I'm very impressed by Victor's commitment to critical disabilities and studies, not as some kind of calculated research opportunity, but something that needs to be done. One interesting strand I think you already have noticed, his training as a historian, which means that his natural impulse is not to look just outward for conceptual frames and intellectual work, but back into Singapore's past. So Michel Foucault meets characters such as Ron Chandran Dudley, who I think is seen not simply as an activist, but also in his own way as an intellectual. And this kind of historical work seems to me very important if we're thinking of decolonizing disability studies. So obviously, Victor's work represents not only an ethical, but also an intellectual commitment. Disability studies in Singapore is important in itself. And I know there are people in the chat already who know more about it than I do, and we'll talk about it. But I'm interested in how the concept of the included that Victor mentions, in which rights are sidestepped, and in which disabled people are both hypervisible and invisible, might be extended to other areas of Singapore society. The new conversations and debates we're having about race, for instance, or in a very different, but I think still related mode, sexuality, especially trans and non-binary identities. And I wonder if the very public debates and tensions on these topics don't signal some kind of breakdown, or at least a renewed engagement with those older, what Victor calls capacitating logics of inclusion that no longer fit, even as there's a struggle to find a critical language that isn't simply a language of individual rights. And I think disability itself becomes a very interesting place to work, because by its very nature, identity politics based on rights are always called into question. There are ongoing debates about the social model in disability studies, which at their heart have this question: is disability an identity? Is it something done to one by society, or is it both, right? So I'm particularly also interested in Victor's parallel project, which I think he only touched on here, to decolonize disability studies, and the difficulty of doing so given global structures of knowledge. Again, it's a question for all of us, I think, in Singapore who write critically in humanities and social sciences. We want a critical purchase on Singapore society, but also at the same time, we want to question global structures of knowledge in which we work that tend to misplace Singapore. So just a couple of questions to end, and then, Victor, feel free to answer them briefly and then get on to others if you want to, right? The first for me would be, given this presence of an environment of inclusion rather than exclusion, what particular activist tactics might disabled people adopt in Singapore? And my second question comes from my own experience in Canada right now, thinking of deinstitutionalization, but also of its dark side. And I think deinstitutionalization happened in many countries just as the state was beginning to become privatized and to retreat. But they're notable successes, but I think it also at times, especially in the area again of mental illness or neuroatypicality, in which through lack of funding, people have simply been abandoned. And paradoxically, the abandonment has often used the language of rights, right? So I'm interested in asking you, Victor, how might we leverage the notion of inclusion to promote some form of just deinstitutionalization in Singapore? And I'll end it there and just say thank you once again for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you very much for that, Philip. I think you're raising questions about knowledge production as a field, and Victor's work existing in a particular space within this field is a really good one. Victor, I wonder if you would like to say a few things first before we turn to the Q&A.
Yes, thank you, Yuyen, and thank you, Victor. And thank you, Philip. And especially to Philip again, thank you for your very kind words and encouragement. It means a lot to me to hear this coming from a well-established and highly respected scholar like you. And as I strive to do meaningful research, I will commit to stay true to the reasons why I started with this field. Let me try to answer your two questions and hopefully address some of the points that you highlighted in your response. So in my research, one of the things that I discuss really is how a language of rights in Singapore is superseded by a language of care. So the inclusion of disabled people, even while it began in 1981, from a position where disability rights were initially highlighted, today tends to fall back into the communitarian logics of care. So care can be a very tricky issue to work with, right? It can be problematic. At times, it falls back onto tropes that depict disability as tragic, in need of charity, pitiful, or hopeless, right? As the ad by the MCYS shows. And it still prevails today, right? The MCYS ad, I think, was in 2016, 2017. And beyond that, one can perhaps look at the yearly large fundraising telethons that are held as key examples of such events that depict charity, disability as charity. But I think there is a lot of purchase that a language of care might also bring to the overall goal of achieving real inclusion, and which allows, in a sense, disabled people a lot of free range, I think, to do the kinds of activism that might be frowned upon, especially with other groups, right? So specifically, we do not see sort of the kind of political protest with disability that perhaps other groups might be embroiled in. But of course, there is also a question of what counts as out of bounds. So one example that I can think of, right, is how, for instance, guide dog users, they constantly face discrimination in their everyday lives and often call for an end to the denial of access. But we don't see any guide dog users being arrested when they call out such acts, even in public. So the focus usually ends up being how we can do better as a society to educate these shop owners, these retail malls and outlets to do better and to care for disabled people. And it does seem that this kind of inclusion is particularly interesting when compared to other kinds of inclusions that are based upon the law and call for sort of law to be changed, rights to be enacted, so to say. And most importantly, with disability, even though there's a lot of influence coming from the outside with disability rights, you don't see disability being called out as, you don't see the inclusion of disabled people being called out as a sort of culture war. And this also brings me to try to answer your question about inclusion as a means to think about deinstitutionalization, which is something that, deinstitutionalization is something that really stands out for me as I try to explain inclusion in Singapore, right? Because on the one hand, you have an inclusion that embraces disabled people. But then you also have these institutions around the island, right, that keep people in wards that might sleep 40 people. If you visit some of these wards, you'll be, aghast at how people are living. Is that real inclusion? And I constantly think about how else we can think about the institutions, or how else we can think about institutions in the landscape of inclusion. And it seems that ultimately, like I say, it falls back upon the language of care. We care for disabled people, hence we put them in institutions because this is the best way to care for them, and that's inclusion. So I would say that we need to, so with regards to the question on deinstitutionalization, I would say that we should need to first consider what a critical praxis of inclusion would look like, given the many different meanings of the term inclusion and what counts as inclusion. What I would strongly advocate for is for us to think of inclusion as a process where we constantly strive to achieve it. But we should be very wary of claiming that the work is already done. So even with this seminar, with the provision of access, this is not perfect. We need to be aware of excluding people, even as we strive towards a collective effort in changing the way we do things. The other point that I want to make around this praxis of inclusion is to think about how disabled people, such as the severely disabled, can be part of the process of inclusion. The issue of representation is a key concern of disability studies research. And some scholars use the figure of the severely disabled as a means to challenge normative structures in society. So one important principle I think that we need to really think about is around claims of being the expert, which has the potential to foreclose other ways of knowing and doing. And so one of the things that I always tell myself as I do my research and my work is, even though I've done a lot of work in this area, I'm very, very careful and wary of saying that I am the expert. And this is especially pertinent in trying to achieve real inclusion, especially when some disabled people might be always already denied an equal forum to be heard because of preconceived notions of what counts as normal. So we really need to be careful over who claims to speak for disabled people. And we also need to evaluate the means in which we understand what speaking means and having a voice means. And this, I think, is one of the more difficult things to do, especially when we think about the severely disabled, because it challenges what it means to be a full and equal citizen. And it also challenges, what it means to be qualified to speak. And this, of course, has a lot of implications in other areas, such as work, policy, education, and even research.
Thank you, Victor. I see that there are already quite a number of very good questions in the chat box. So I'm going to go ahead and I think in the limited time we have, we may not be able to get to all the questions. So what I would like to do is I will read 3 questions perhaps, and then Victor, from those first 3 questions, you can decide how you might want to address some of the issues that come up. The first question is from Gregory Lee, and Gregory says, what do you think of Singapore's current model, and how do you think we can do better at this current model? The second question comes from Ian Chong, and Ian says, on disability rights, what do you think are the effects of Singapore's accession to the CRPD? I guess that's the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, and the UPR process, the Universal Periodic Review process, on the lived experiences of people with disabilities in Singapore. Do you think Singapore's participation in the UPR process provides sufficient consideration and consultation of people with disabilities? Given the focus on visibility, inclusion, and the productivity of people with disabilities in Singapore, where do you think active, prior, and informed consent of people with disabilities in legislation and state policies fit in? So the second question, I suppose, is somewhat related to the first, in terms of Singapore's current model and what you think about it. And the third question comes from S.Y. Ong. There is a very fine line between inclusion/included and inspiration porn. What are your thoughts on this blur boundary, considering our society's different perspectives? Okay. So I'll stop with those 3 questions if Victor would like to address them either generally or specifically. Yep. Victor?
Thank you, Yuyan. I guess the issue here is also to think about what the current model is. And for me, having had academic experiences and sort of in different disability settings in the UK, in the United States, and in Singapore and of course in Australia. It seems to me that one thing that really happens and really contrasts Singapore with other countries is really the investment that is put into funding change when the change is deemed needed and meaningful. So I would say that in terms of our current model, we do have a benevolent state that cares, and that in itself is useful for the creation of inclusion. I think the challenge here is to convince state agencies and the state, of course, to think differently about how best we can improve the model, such that it brings us nearer to what some of my disabled friends and disabled activists are talking about. How do we then perhaps ensure that there is equal representation of disabled people in first the agencies that represent them, as well as within sort of policy making spheres. And this sort of addresses Gregory's and Ian's question around how we can do better. With the CRPD, with the Convention of Rights and the UPR, I think one of the main key focus of the UPR, right, the periodic review, is that it creates a process where disabled people's organizations are involved in the provision of periodic reviews. So that in itself is a way in which disabled people and their organizations can be actively involved in sort of ensuring and holding to account state and state agencies to the making and fulfillment of inclusion and rights in that sense. I think the problem with the Singapore disability landscape is that the number of disabled people's organization, in the sense that, so when I say disabled people's organizations, I'm talking about organizations that are led by of disabled people, rather than organizations that serve disabled people for disabled people, right? So organizations of disabled people, if I am not wrong, there is perhaps only 3 of them that are set up to be led by disabled people. So Disabled People's Association Singapore, which is the offshoot of the International Disability Rights Movement, HWA, which is Handicaps Welfare Association, and the Singapore Association of the Visually Handicapped. These are the only 3 true disabled people's organizations, right? So when it comes to the UPR, usually falls back upon only a few of these organizations, which then creates this sort of misrepresentation. I wouldn't, okay, not misrepresentation per se, but rather a sort of marginalization even within the disability sector of who gets to speak in that sense, right? So if I would see the model improve, and I think I echo a lot of what some of the disabled friends and activists are talking about here in Singapore, is to really call for greater representation of disabled people in both the organizations that concern them, and as well as in state agencies and policy spheres that involve them. So I think in one of my writings, I call for the enabling master plan to also involve disabled people, having a disabled person as a co-chair. That will work. And I see with the Purple Parade, that is happening in recent years. I think with SY, right? SY's question around inspiration porn. I think this sort of also addresses Philip's question around how we think about theories that are developed elsewhere around the world. So inspiration porn is sort of this idea that disabled people are celebrated for living ordinary lives. And this for me is very interesting, because a lot of what is happening in Singapore around the media representations of disabled people is essentially that. It is inspiration porn, right? You celebrate disabled people for being able to live and lead everyday lives. But yet, I think with inspiration porn, you don't get that sense of resistance in Singapore. So I think what we need to really come to as well is to think about how experiences of disability is very different from that in other countries, and how then we can try to explain some of these ideas of disability in Singapore.
Thank you, Victor. There are actually many questions in the chat, and I'm afraid that we don't have adequate time. So I'm going to take my chair's prerogative and skip to a question that I think hasn't quite been, that Victor hasn't quite sort of elaborated on yet. Yeah, and this is David Han's question. To what extent is the communitarian logic of inclusion propagated in Singapore really about the communitarian logic of hierarchical inclusion, whereby the state and its institutions hold exclusive power to circumscribe the disabled, to participate in lower strata of society, and preventing the disabled from participating in ways that allow them the equality to shape the dominant narrative discourse in society?
So let me try to address this by talking about one of the analysis that I do in one of my later chapters in this PhD research, where I talk about the provision of accessible infrastructure, and I use the idea, the analytic of mobility, to think about infrastructure and accessibility and sort of social mobility in society today. So I think that David points out a very interesting point here, which is that when inclusion happens, it tends to be it tends to work in ways that tries to fold and embrace disabled people into existing structures and normative ways of doing, right? So when we hire disabled people, we always talk about productivity, right? And one of the ways in which that happens is through ideas of customized employment, where disabled people are hired and then paid a wage that correlates to their productivity. And I think that in itself is sort of also reflects what David is talking about, because it falls into traditional ways of doing in Singapore, meritocracy, right? We should pay people and allow people the ability to work in society based on their ability, right? But we don't challenge such traditional ways of knowing and doing. So meritocracy doesn't get challenged for what counts as being able to participate. So of course, I would agree that in such a way, you see disabled people sort of, when they come into work, they work and they are usually much lowly paid than other people. And I think one of the sort of manifestation of this is in recent debates over employment rate. So if I'm not wrong, I think last year or the year before, there was this parliament kind of discussion, right, around the employment of disabled people. And one clear thing that emerged from this discussion in parliament is that disabled people are underemployed and unemployed. I think the statistics shows that maybe only 1/3 or 20-30%, I don't remember the number, are in the workforce. So over 60-70% are not in the workforce.
Thank you very much. I think we have time perhaps for one final question. Yeah, I would like to assure everyone that your questions in the chat box, even if we don't get to them, we will make sure that Victor has access to them later on, so that he can continue to think about them as he completes his work. But let me now ask a final question. I choose now a final question, which maybe would be a good place for us to end today. This is from Reddy Tay. The current state-led approach as it stands exists on a rather macro level. How should we, as individuals in our day-to-day lives, better advocate for inclusion on a daily basis? Not just this, I think really means, and not just focus on sort of state-led campaigns and events. So what can we do as individuals in our day-to-day lives?
So I think, thank you, Rudy, for this question. I think some of us in the know will also be aware that there are a lot of active organizing that disabled people are actually doing in recent months and perhaps in the last year or so. So with the Disability Studies Facebook group, of course, that's one. But elsewhere, we see a lot of disabled people also organizing in that sense. So I would suggest that really organizing, getting together, sharing knowledge, sharing ideas of how we can push forward, that would be the way. So I want to give a shout out to some of this organizing. Eric Chen's autistic WhatsApp group, together with other like-minded autistics, that is such a wonderful disabled-led initiative that has emerged in recent months. You also see new organizations popping up. I think Cassandra Chiu, who is known as the first female guide dog user in Singapore, as well as Joy Leong, who is the first autistic, openly autistic PhD holder from UNSW, and they have sort of started this organization that looks to provide assistant dogs to beyond people with visual impairment. So I think there's a lot of this undercurrents that's going on. And as I mentioned, there seems to be also this idea that this activism is tolerated. They don't get called out, you know. So I think with disability activism, my sense is you can really push the boundaries a little bit further. I mean, we don't see disabled people getting arrested, right? So I don't think disabled people will get arrested for holding up a sign in public with a smiley, right? Or protesting their discrimination in society. And one of the things that I always tell people is something that's very interesting that happens to me, because I've been in this work around disability for maybe 10 years or so. And whenever people ask me what I do in Singapore, and I tell them I do disability, the number one reaction that I'll often get from people is, well, you have a caring heart, you have a kind heart. So it's interesting for me, because in other countries, I get told it's interesting or I get told it's political. But in Singapore, it becomes something that falls back upon kindness, upon caringness. And it's such a huge disjuncture. But I also think that there is sort of opportunity to push the politics of disability and leverage on that of care in that sense.
Thank you very much. I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you, Victor, for sharing this really important work. And I think judging from the audience enthusiasm and also the large number of people who've showed up this Saturday, this is I think our biggest showing yet for the Junior Scholars Series. You know, I think there's clearly a great deal of interest in your work. And I think this overlap between scholarship and activism, you know, between thinking and doing, I think this is exactly the sort of thing that we at Academia SG really want to be a part of and want to foster, you know. So thank you, Victor, for your work. Thank you as well, Philip, for your really thoughtful and incisive comments. If everyone could join me in showing appreciation for Victor and Philip in some way, either with the icon or okay, or showing this. Great, applause. That would be wonderful. Thank you everyone also on the team for assisting with access support today. I would say this has also been a really good learning experience for us at Academia SG to improve, on what we do in order to enhance people's access, right? Enhance access to our events. So thank you very much for that. And I appreciate everyone for joining us this Saturday morning. The full video of this webinar, together with videos of our earlier seminars, will be on our website. And our Singapore Studies Junior Scholar Seminar Series continues later this month. Please go to our webpage, www.academia.sg, to find out more. If you haven't already, please also follow us on Facebook or sign up for our newsletter. And we hope that everyone will continue to be part of this Singapore Studies community that we are gradually building, whether as fellow scholars and academics, or as knowledge producers in other fields, or as interested and engaged members of the public. We really need and welcome your continued participation. This is the 5th seminar in our series, and as I've said, it is the most well attended so far. Overall, in all these seminars, we've been so impressed by the quality of our junior colleagues' presentations, as well as by the energy of the discussion with audience members. And I think if this is the future of Singapore studies, we really have a lot to look forward to. So thank you again, everybody, and have a good weekend.